Good evening, everyone. This is Mary Lynn Cardell. I'm a registered dietitian, and just wanted to say thank you so much for joining us tonight for our webinar on understanding farming practices, labels, kind of how our farm supply, the food that we eat, is produced so that we can feel confident and comfortable in the food choices that we make. So today's webinar will be about an hour-long webinar. You'll receive 1 hour of licensing hours for today's webinar. It will be an hour long, like I said. It is required that you spend the entire hour with us. So I'll kind of go through those, making sure everybody gets on so nobody misses out on that information. So my name is Mary Lynn Cardell. I'm a registered dietitian, and Midwest Childcare is sponsoring these webinars. So we really want to thank you to them for supporting these webinars, so that we can have licensing hours for all of you and provide the education that you all need, especially during COVID. But hopefully we can continue these way past COVID, because they've obviously been a pretty big hit, and people seem to be able to like having access to webinars. And so we will hopefully continue having these webinars throughout the next year and beyond. So thank you so much for joining in. Like I said today, today's webinar will be about an hour long. It will be 1 hour of licensing hours. And in order to receive those licensing hours, the state does require that you are in attendance the entire time. So I can only give a certificate if you are on the webinar the entire time that we are presenting. It is also required, in order for me to give you a certificate, that you are actively participating. Because these are webinars, it's hard to know if you're actively participating. And so the way the state knows if you are actively participating is participating in all the polls, as well as a survey at the end of the webinar. So throughout the webinar, there are multiple polls, and so it is required that you complete all the polls, as well as complete the survey at the end of the webinar in order to receive a certificate. So I appreciate you all doing that and sticking with us through this entire webinar. That way, because we know that when you're in person, that you're engaged, but when we're through virtual, it's harder for us to know and the state to verify the engagement, and so that's why it's required. So I'm going to say it once again: in order for me to send a certificate to each of you, it is required that you participate in the entire webinar and also participate in all of the polls, as well as the survey at the end of the webinar. So I appreciate that, and we'll get started. So just want to make sure, if you are not familiar with NSPERS or have not already joined NSPERS, we do want to encourage everybody to connect with NSPERS and get registered. It's the Nebraska Early Childhood Professional Record System. And what they do, and this is the contact information, so what they do is they help in organizing. It has all the upcoming trainings that you need. It's a good resource for questions, but also to enter your certificates and all of your training information. So we do want to make sure that all of you are registered with NSPERS. That way it makes it a little bit easier for you to kind of keep track of your hours and upcoming trainings. There is a questions tab, so making sure that if you do have any questions, there is a questions tab. Please you feel free to write a question, and I'll get back to you. I'll get to that question throughout the webinar. So if you have any questions, please feel free to send the question to me. We also have 2 handouts in the handout section, and so I do encourage you to download those handouts prior to getting out of the webinar or ending the webinar today. Once you've ended the webinar, it won't be able to access that unless you go back in through the GoToWebinar website. And so I would encourage all of you to access those webinars, those handouts, if that's something that interests you. So thinking about, hormones are something that we hear about oftentimes with food. And so we hear about it with milk and things, and it's been kind of a concern. And so we want to kind of think about, are there hormones in our food? And the answer, and why do farmers use hormones? So those are some questions that we're going to answer today. And so thinking about hormones are in every living thing. So yes, our hormones are in food. So if something says something is hormone free, that's not really a factual statement. If it's a food item that's been living, right? Which is, all of our food, plants, right? Whether it's plant, milk, meat, eggs, fresh fruit, whatever it is. So all living things contain hormones, including plants. So if something says it's hormone free or free of hormones, that's probably not an accurate statement. It can say that there is no hormones that have been added, or it's been raised without hormones or without added hormones. And so those are okay statements, but there's nothing that we eat that is actually hormone free. And that's because all things that are living contain some types of hormones. And so that's just kind of we want to make sure that you as a consumer, that you're an educated consumer, that you are making the decisions for your meals and meal planning and grocery shopping based on information that's factual. And so just kind of being aware of how those statements are. So for pork and poultry, added hormones aren't allowed by the United States Department of Agriculture in pork or poultry. So we don't add any added hormones in pork or poultry. And a claim of no hormones added on pork or poultry products must be followed by the statement that says federal regulations prohibit the use of hormones. And the reason they're doing is they're trying to help you as a consumer not be misinformed by marketing. And so we know that the federal government does not allow any use of hormones in pork or poultry products. And so those are things that are regulated by the USDA. So kind of talking about hormones and how hormones are in all items. So this is just some information on what they call the estrogen activity of common foods. So we know certain foods are higher in different hormones, and estrogen is one of those hormones. That estrogen, they're called phytoestrogens, are in plant-based proteins. And so things like soy flour, tofu, which is also a soy product, those are really high in this what we call phytoestrogens. But that's just a hormone that a plant produces. It doesn't mean it's the exact same hormone of estrogen it's in our human body. So pinto beans, white bread, peanuts are all very high in those phytoestrogens possibly, as well as things like eggs, butter, milk, which most people assume that an animal-based product is going to have more of those estrogens, phytoestrogens, but it's actually those are things that are more common in plant-based products. And so, and then a beef that's been implanted with a hormone, and a beef that's been not implanted with a hormone, those are actually on our lowest amounts of estrogen. And granted, those are steers, so just being aware of that. But just kind of being aware that we know that all these foods have some hormones, and that doesn't mean that dysregulates how our body responds. Especially with soy, there has been some kind of research on the role of soy in estrogen-based cancers and estrogen-based diseases. And so a couple, probably 10 years ago, they said don't eat soy foods. But what they're finding is that our body actually isn't responding in the same way to these phytoestrogens as they do to actually estrogen itself. And so now they're saying we don't want to limit our soy foods as long as they're natural soy products, meaning not processed. So things like edamame, even tofu, minimally processed. But we do want to, kind of think about those foods that are super high processed, like soy patties, even soy milk. Those are some things that some people, the research can show that some individuals who may be at higher risk, that those aren't some things that you want to talk to your doctor about. The research is really iffy about whether it's necessary, but generally, as a professional, we say talk to your physician to see if you're someone who needs to monitor those foods. But in general, things like edamame, tofu, tempeh, those are foods that are really good sources of protein and don't contain a lot of estrogen. So when we think about estrogen production in humans, as well, and compared to a cattle, so a pregnant woman has 19,600,000 nanograms of estrogen versus a 500 grams of beef, which is about 17 ounces of beef, right? We could tell people 5 to 6 ounces of meat a day. This is 17 ounces of beef, has less than 7 nanograms. So very low intake of estrogen in our beef. And so just kind of being aware that our body has estrogen and that it's not something that we really need to be deeply concerned with in general. So when we think about, what our food labels say, it will say no hormones. So we know beef or poultry and pork, the federal government does not allow any added hormones. And so they're not allowed to give any hormones when raising hogs or poultry. And so the claim no hormones added cannot be used on the label unless they say the federal regulations prohibit the use of hormones, just to make sure that people aren't marketing their products in a misrepresenting that product, meaning acting like their product is better because it doesn't have hormones when another product people may assume does, when it actually doesn't. They're just not saying anything about the hormones because it's not allowed. So just so you know, just being aware of what the labels actually say. So for beef, the term no hormones administered may be approved for use on the label of beef if sufficient documentation is provided to the FDA by the farmer showing that no hormones had been used in raising those animals, because we do know that in beef more often hormones are added, and they're allowed to be added in beef. And so it's only through documentation that the farmer provides if they can say that there's no hormones added. Generally, that's going to be our organic beefs, not even necessarily our grass-fed beefs. So, and why do farmers use hormones? And often is because the male cattle, which are bulls, are neutered early in life, and that there's that's things that are happen sometimes with the cattle, and so the bulls would naturally continue to produce hormones as they grow older. And we know, just for adults and humans too, when we have more hormones, especially for males, testosterone, that testosterone increases our lean body mass. So it increases our muscle, and muscle is what meat is. And so we do know that the bulls would naturally be producing these hormones as they develop and as they grow. And that hormone helps in making more meat, meaning more lean body mass. And so that's why they would use those hormones, is to mimic the lack of hormones that are happening. So it's kind of like, if you had a hysterectomy and so you have hormone replacement therapy, that's kind of the same type of thought process, is that hormone replacement therapy that's happening because these bulls are neutered. So just to kind of give you an understanding of why. So a female cow called a heifer is a cow that's over a year but has not produced a calf. And so we do know that a lot of our cows that are raised for meat aren't having, they may not be having calves. And so the heifer, which has not had a calf, also produces hormones, but less than an older female cow. And so they are also supplemented to support that weight gain. So it's kind of the same idea that, we know that, a younger female, prepubescent or, go through puberty, 13-year-old female may have had their menstrual cycle, but their muscle mass is much less. Their weight is much lower despite their height. And same with young cows. And so the idea is it helps in producing the hormones help in increasing that lean body mass or that muscle that is necessary for our meat supply, which is what the muscles are, is our meat. So sometimes farmers use something called BST, or bovine somatropin, and that's a hormone that is thought to produce leaner cows, but also increase milk output. Probably about 15, 20 years ago, I know my daughter was an infant at the time when they were talking about, she's 22, so maybe it was longer than that. But they were, a big talk about why kids were going through puberty earlier. And some were associating it with the BST, or the bovine somatropin hormone that was added to milking cows as a possible reason. Research has shown that that's not true, but that was kind of a big push. And actually, the research showed, hey, that's not actually true, that our body actually denatures, which means breaks down that hormone, so we actually don't absorb the hormone. And so if you look through this, it says it's denatured by processing for baby formula. So it's actually broken down. So it's actually broken down into components that it's not, our body doesn't look at it as a hormone. Also, about 90% of it is killed during the pasteurization of milk, and also in our hydrochloric acid in our stomach. So what the research shows was the bovine somatropin hormone wasn't most likely, and they could say with good confidence that it was not probably related to an earlier maturation or young women going through puberty. Most likely it was that their body's weights were higher from higher food intake. Also, more nutritious diets, as kids were younger, had more nutritious diets. But the backlash was already kind of started, and so many people were really nervous and scared about BST as being a possible issue with hormones for young girls. And so most milk supply now is actually bovine free. And so, for a while there, it was a big label. People would put that on: no hormones added, no BST added. It's so common now that it's not added that some places don't even put it in there on their label. But most of our milk supply does not have added hormones to increase the milk output. And so that's kind of just so you know, it was a big deal for several years. Could it still happen? Absolutely, because it's still allowed. But most milk producers now, even non-organic, like a traditional milk producer, not an organic milk producer, most of those are actually bovine, free of any kind of hormones or bovine somatropin. So just so you know. So the BST is digested by humans like any other protein. So proteins are in milks and meats and in some grains and things like that. And so they're actually broken down like a hormone when they get in our GI tract. Our body doesn't look at that hormone. It looks at it as a protein. It doesn't look at it as a hormone that it's going to digest and put into our bloodstream in the same way that we have other hormones. So the residue level of hormones in food have continually been demonstrated to be safe and below any level that could affect humans. And so this is something that is constantly being evaluated. Our food supply is, the U.S. food supply is considered to be the safest food supply in the world. It's continually being monitored, and we have, the FDA, Food and Drug Administration. We have the USDA, the United States Department of Agriculture, and both of those are overlooking in our food supply. So we kind of have it coming from two different angles to make sure that we have a safe food supply. Also, BST, the bovine somatropin hormone, is what we call species specific. That's a hard word for me to say, meaning it does not do anything in humans. So it's not like an animal to human transfer, meaning it only affects bovine, or it doesn't affect humans. And once again, that's because we are breaking it down as a protein. So studies done on the BST and the RBST, which is like the RNA version, indicate that it will not survive human digestion, and it actually is broken down because it's an amino acid, that protein. And it does not have any effect on human growth receptors, which is what the concern was, 15, 20 years ago. It's been shown not to have any effect. The bovine BST does not attach to our human growth receptors, which would be what the fear was. So we do have a poll. So once again, I'm going to launch this poll, and just so that you know that I'm going to just reiterate, just in case anyone came on. In order for me to give you a certificate, the state requires that you were present throughout the entire webinar and that you participate in all the polls, as well as the survey at the end. That demonstrates to the state that you are actively participating, and that just because it's virtual, that you weren't just turned on the computer and leaving, that you're an active participant. And so it is required for me to send a survey to you, or a certificate to you, that you participate in all the polls. So I do appreciate that. So it looks like we have about 3/4 of everybody voted so far. So we just need a couple more people to get up there and vote. I'm going to give you about another 10 to 15 seconds, and then we'll close out the poll. So the question is, hormones are present in every little living thing, even plants, true or false? Okay. One more minute. All right. Can I close the poll? So hormones are present in every living thing, even plants, and that is true. So everything that animal, plant products, all have some hormones in them. So all items do have some hormones in them. So when we're thinking about the word natural on the label, what we may think about natural and what the USDA defines as natural may be two different things. And so what we want to make sure is we understand what the USDA and FDA identify as the word natural on a label. So natural is a broad term. It applies to foods that are minimally processed and free of synthetic preservatives, artificial sweeteners, colors, flavors. So anything that's artificial sweeteners, artificial colors, artificial flavors, and artificial additives. They're free of growth hormones. They have no antibiotics. They have no hydrogenated oils. They have no stabilizers and no emulsifiers. So there's a lot of things in there, right? A lot of our food has emulsifiers. So anything that needs to be that separates. So thinking about peanut butter, our regular peanut butter that doesn't separate, that has emulsifiers in it. Those emulsifiers keep the oils from separating. Things that help in keeping things creamy and smooth and not, have emulsifiers, as well as stabilizers, things that are, shelf stable for a period of time. Those are all going to have some type of stabilizer. And hydrogenated oils are oftentimes used in our baked goods and our breads and things like that. They are getting weaned out, or we're avoiding or getting fewer and fewer of those products. They want to eliminate hydrogenated oils in our products. And so many foods, 10 years ago said no hydrogenated oils, like it was a big deal. Now most foods have no hydrogenated oils, and the reason is because what they found is those hydrogenated oils are really linked to heart disease, increasing our cholesterol, increasing our triglycerides. And so, as well as, kind of artificial sweeteners, artificial colors, artificial flavors, and artificial additives are in a lot of different foods. So those are all in that term natural. So it can't have any of those things if it can be under that term natural on your label. Products using the label should explain that has no artificial ingredients. So nothing artificial has been added or used in the processing. So most foods that are labeled natural, all natural, or 100% natural are not subject to specific government controls, with the exception of meat and poultry. So oftentimes that this is left up to the discretion of the company And with the exception of beef and poultry, those are regulated. So for meat and poultry, the USDA defines natural as no artificial flavoring, no artificial colorings, ingredients, or chemical preservatives, and no artificial or synthetic ingredients, not taking into account the animal welfare. Means if they had to do something to take care of that animal, they may have had something, but in general, that there's no artificial items that are in the processing. So for example, sometimes poultry oftentimes has like a fluid, what do you call it, a liquid that's added to help keep that, like a sodium added to help keep that plump and it from drying out. And so it's got sometimes it has a preservative in there. And so because it increases the shelf life. So those little things, it's the after processing. So if an animal had some kind of feed that had artificial ingredients, then that's not considered. It's in the processing. So products carrying these claim can be only minimally processed, and so the raw product was not fundamentally altered. And so we see this sometimes if something had flavorings added to it, unless it's a natural flavoring, unless they have no stabilizers or emulsifiers in there, it can be called natural, but it's usually after the processing if they've added something that then it can no longer be called natural. So if for beef that's been marketed as naturally raised, it must be grown without any growth promotants or hormones, and it must be verified in that it's enrolled in what we call the USDA verification program. So that the farmer or whoever raises the cattle has to verify that they're not using any growth promotants, which is our hormones. And the animals cannot be given antibiotics or any animal byproducts. So that's kind of what natural beef was. So we're going to have organic beef, we're going to have grass-fed beef, we're going to have natural beef. So it's all means different things. Just so you know that all those different terminologies, it's really kind of confusing, I think, when we're looking at these products in the store. So this hopefully will give you some ideas of what those terms mean. So natural is it has no growth promotants, which is hormones. It is in the USDA's verification program. They do not have antibiotics or any animal byproducts. And what that means is sometimes the byproducts sometimes they're given like bone meal as a byproduct, and they can't do that. So the bone meal is from an animal that the animals eat for calcium. So they couldn't be given something like that. So when we're talking about something that's called certified naturally grown, this is a nonprofit. So there's a USDA's program, but this is a different program. So you might see differences in these labels. So the certified naturally grown is a nonprofit alternative to the USDA certification program. And why they came up with that is because it's quite expensive and quite a process for those farmers to go through for the USDA verification program. So this is something that's been tailored for your small scale, kind of your farm to table individuals, small farms that may come to the farmer's market that aren't going through a retail outlet. And so they can be certified that they're naturally grown without having to go through the process and the expense that the USDA verification program requires. So this is through what we call a peer review certification. So the other farmers are reviewing and doing the work. So that's the difference. The USDA is the government. This is peer reviews. So the concern is that with a peer review, there's much more likelihood that people can kind of nudge each other or you pat your back, I'll pat my back, I'll pat your back, you pat my back kind of thing. And so that's kind of the question about how legitimate this certified naturally grown label is. And so because it is considered a peer review by farmers as well as beekeepers producing food for their locally owned, their local communities. So just kind of information, if it's something that if naturally grown is important to you, yet you go to a farmer's market or you get your food from a local farmer, this is something that you could ask, and if that's something that's important to you. Some farmers have criticized the cost and the process they need to go through to participate in the U.S. program, and so it's just this certified naturally, has come up, but once again, it's kind of like you have to make sure that you feel it's a legitimate company that's getting certified for you. So, sorry about that. Okay, so now I'm kind of going to organic versus non-organic farming. And this has been a hot button topic for years. So many people have an opinion on organic versus non-organic. I'm not here to convince you one way or the other. It really is a personal decision. It's dependent on your cost, what you think is important to you as far as natural resources, what you feel, kind of your own beliefs. But it really is more, the research shows they're pretty equivalent. One's not better than the other. One's not worse than the other. They're actually pretty equivalent. They have pros and cons of each. And so it really is a personal decision. And I'm not here to make, to sway you one way or the other. I'm just here to kind of give you the information so that you, as a consumer, can make those decisions that you feel is best for your budget, as well as your kiddos that you're serving and your own family. So kind of understanding the difference between organic versus non-organic is important. So if a food is considered organic, it must, the USDA regulates this pretty closely. It must have no synthetic fertilizers, and synthetic is the word because organic products use fertilizers. They're just natural fertilizers. So it's no synthetic fertilizers, no synthetic pesticides or insecticides, no GMO or genetically engineered plants or animals, and it must be what they call environmentally sound and sustainable growing practices. And so those are the things that we really want to think about, is that environmentally sound and sustainable growing practices. So why this is kind of becoming a hot button topic is we know that our food supply, we keep having more and more people in the world. We have to support and feed those people, and our farmland is not getting. We're not growing more farmland, right? That's what they talk about, going to Mars and having more farmland, or having what they call these farms in layered farms, or farms that are kind of stacked farming. I don't know if you've ever heard of that, but stacked farming, in which they have like big buildings that they actually have their farmland actually in like pots that are large pots that are elevated almost like floors, because we are so short of land, and we have more people to feed. And so some individuals who are very concerned about our shortage of land and the number of mouths we have to feed are very supportive of what we call traditional or non-organic type of feeding practice, because it can serve more people with less, more people generally produces with more production. But organic farming also is based on what environmentally sound, and so they use like crop rotation as one of their, they make sure that they're really taking care of that land. The issue is that takes a little bit more time, and we definitely generally do not get as much of a production or produce that comes out of an organic farming situation. So that's kind of where those two different thought processes kind of are, and that's kind of where that debate comes from. So, so when we think about what qualifies as food as organic, they have to have, for organic animal products, they have to have 100% organic animal feed. So it has to start from the time they eat. Their food intake has to be organic. They have to have mandatory outside access when the weather is suitable. It doesn't identify how much time, and so that's always been kind of a sticking point that some people, say it doesn't make that much time, but cows and things like that, they're all going to be outside quite a bit. No antibiotics, no growth hormones, and no animal byproducts in the feed, which is things like the bone meal and things that sometimes occurs as a nutrient source. Also, since most organic farming uses manure or poop as its fertilizer, it must be managed to prevent crop or water contamination. So we do know that oftentimes when there is outbreaks of things like salmonella and listeria and things, it's oftentimes related to the manure because the manure was not managed, and so it got on things like lettuce is one of our most common, our lettuces and things that grow in the ground that are soft that we don't wash very well are probably our most common foodborne illness, foods that are most susceptible to foodborne illnesses. Oftentimes that's because of the waste from contaminants in manure. So the USDA regulates labeling for organic crops, livestock, processed foods, and wild crops. The organic seal, which you see up on your right, the USDA organic seal, it's in a brown circle with the green and the white. It's used on the principal display panel, so on the front label of a product that is 100% organic, or if the product's ingredients have less than 5% of non-organic content. So they can only use this label if it's considered 100% organic or has less than 5% of non-organic products in there. So it can't be used if it's 50% organic or just a little bit organic. It has to have a high amount of organic products in there. And they must identify all organic ingredients on the label. So it has to say organic corn, organic blueberries, organic, every item that's organic. And certified in the label and the ingredients list. And certified organic products must also include the name of their certifying agent on the label's information panel. So they can't just put that out there without saying who verified that information for them. So that hopefully gives you all some confidence in what you're, it's kind of a double layer. They have to put their certifying agency and also that they're USDA organic, that label. So when we talk about organic farming practices, the emphasis is on the crop rotation and what we call companion planting, finding out what uses different nutrients in the soil. So some, crops are going to use different amounts of iron or zinc or in the soil, and so they do companion planting, especially that crop rotation. They don't plant the same crop every year because certain crops are going to use up certain nutrients. And so by doing what's called crop rotation, then they can kind of stabilize and restabilize that nutrient that one product. So maybe beans require use more of iron in the soil or some other item in the soil, whereas corn may use less of that. And so they rotate that crop to kind of help stabilize the amount of nutrients in that soil. They also use what they call biological pest control, mixed cropping, and fostering of insect predators. So sometimes they'll use things like different kinds of bugs or biological pest controls that are not damaging or are natural products in order to manage bugs in the soil. They all have to be natural products. So there are certain what they call naturally occurring pesticides. Obviously, we need pesticides. That's what's going to, the pesticides can really damage our plants. And so the pesticides that are what's called naturally occurring are pyrethrin and rotenone, and those are permitted, but synthetic, anything that's man-made, are prohibited. So only those what they call naturally occurring pesticides, which are this pyrethrin and rotenone, those are permitted. So it doesn't mean they don't use pesticides. It means that they're using naturally occurring pesticides. Still need to wash your plants. Organic isn't any safer necessarily. Sometimes the rule is the idea that it could actually, have more exposure to things like the manure. So you still really want to make sure you're washing those really well. In 2017, they did come up and clarify some of the organic rules so that there's a lot more consistency in what that means. So if something's organic, we wanted to make sure it wasn't. Before that, it wasn't. It's kind of willy-nilly. It wasn't as clear-cut, and so they did come up in 2017 with some rules. And one of them is that they require that producers provide animals with daily access to outdoor, and that the outdoor areas includes vegetation and or soil. Meaning you can't just put on cement. They have to have, them being able to eat grass or hay, corn, those types of things. Additionally, they have to have exit doors that must be distributed so that the animals have easy access, so that it's not like just one side, and if an animal can't get in and out freely, it doesn't mean that they have frequent doors, but that they have to have more exit doors that the animals can enter and exit as if needed or desired. It does not allow enclosed porches to be considered outdoors or to meet the requirements for outdoor access. So these are things like our small mom and pop. So if something's on an enclosed porch, it's not considered in the organic rules. It also restricts the use of artificial lights, and I'm not sure if you've ever seen any of those videos. They do this a lot with different plants, but also like chickens and things like that. They use artificial lights. So organic is not allowed to use artificial lights in growing their products, particularly their plants and things like particularly plants, but they use them also for chickens sometimes. It limits the amount of ammonia in the air, so encouraging frequent cleaning. So it's not a lot of urine smell. Requires perching space for laying chickens, so they have to be able to move around. They can't perch. They have to be able to sit down and rest. They can't just be enough that they have to stand. It describes when producers can confine animals indoors temporarily, and codifies flexibility for producers to confine animals when the animal's health, safety, or well-being of that animal or other animals could be just jeopardized. So that's when they, what they did is they gave more rules to the farmers saying when an animal can be confined and what does that confinement mean, and we're kind of really identifying that to protect the animal as well as the other animals. It also, this is something that I think people were really happy, is that they added that humane handling requirements for transporting the livestock and poultry was implemented, and they also clarified what that humane slaughter requirements are. And so, for some, the big thing is that vegetarian kids, they feel like the slaughtering is very inhumane, and so I think that this was something that they had done. One, because they care about the animals, and two, to help people understand that they're trying to make every effort to protect these animals as much as possible, even though we do know that we have to, as a society, have these animals in our food supply, because that is, that's one of our main sources of nutrition. And so we do have to make sure that we are respectful, that they are required to slaughter these animals in order to produce our food supply. It's up to you if you want to. I mean, that's your personal decision. I'm not telling you should be, eat meat or not eat meat. I'm just kind of explaining the information. It also prohibits several types of physical alterations. So what that means is they can't debeak the chickens, which is pretty awful and inhumane to even think about, or cutting off a cow's tail. just different things, that they cannot do as a rule for organic. So it just clarifies things, and if that's something that humane animal, for animal cruelty and stuff like that is very important to you, then those are reasons that you may want to choose using organic items. So non-food items, personal care item product companies can brand any personal care product as organic with little USD oversight, as long as they do not use the USDA organic seal or certification. So what this is saying is that there really isn't any oversight. The USDA does not look or monitor non-food items, and so they can say organic, and they just can't use the seal. But the organic means pretty much nothing. So anyone can say organic. They can say organic ice and organic pens and organic plates or organic. And if they're not food items, only food items are regulated by the USDA. So just so that's clear. So non-food items are not regulated by the USDA. It doesn't mean they can all say they're organic if they want to. It doesn't mean they actually are. But some retailers like Whole Foods have stepped up their own standards, and there is what they call a private certification for non-food items. And so if you are someone who really that's important to you, you can look and see on the food label or on the label, the item, whatever you're buying, has what they call the NSF/ANSI 305 certification. And that's a private certification that some companies will purchase to show that their items have been, for cotton or the wood, that those items have been organically manufactured. So when you think about which is better, clinical studies have shown that there's no difference in taste or nutritional value of organic versus non-organic. It's a personal preference. Some people like the taste of organic versus non-organic, but most people can't tell a difference in blind taste tests, the difference between organic versus non-organic. And the research shows that when they have lab tests on the nutritional value, there's very little difference in the actual nutritional value of an organic versus a non-organic product. The independent and duplicated research studies continue to show that organic is not healthier. There's not an advantage to one or the other. It's really truly a personal preference, as well as what fits in with your budget, your values, those types of things. When we talk about the USDA, their non-food items only they can only have the USDA organic seal if it's made entirely from food or agriculture products, right? Because USDA is only doing food and agriculture, overseen by the National Organic Program. So, and the USDA does not regulate the use of the word organic on non-food items. So I think this is really important. If you're someone who's, lots of items can say that they're organic, doesn't mean it's regulated. So sales of organic non-food items like organic cleaners, organic cosmetics, organic clothing, they're not regulated. So they can say that word. It doesn't mean anything unless they did that private certification like Whole Foods does. But organic is a huge business, so it's a $3 billion business. But it doesn't mean that non-food items are necessarily regulated unless it's from food or agriculture products, things like cotton, wood, those types of things. Dry cleaners often promote organic, but there's no legal definition for the practice of dry cleaning, so don't get snowballed with that. And then the word natural has no legal meaning for non-food items either. So natural wood or natural could be the color, but there's no really meaning behind it. It's really kind of interpretation of the manufacturer. So clothing, sheets, mattresses made from organic fibers can be certified by the Global Organic Textile Standard, which is, again, a third party that reviews how those manufacturers, so a company who wants to have their clothing, sheets, mattresses that are made from cotton or silks, If they want to consider themselves organic, they can actually get reviewed by this third party, the Global Organic Textile Standard. And so if it has that certification, then it's most likely made from all organic products. But there's been really no research about what's the benefit of having like organic cotton or organic silk versus conventional. So pesticides. So once again, it's a use of pesticides. It's not the use of pesticides, because all organic versus non-organic are all going to have some pesticides. It's where the pesticides came from. So organic pesticides and fungicides are those that come from natural sources and are lightly processed. So fungicides, we talked about the pesticides earlier. Fungicides are copper and sulfur. And then our fertilizers are usually manure or compost or bone meal. And then conventional pesticides are synthetic or man-made. They can have, basically chemicals that you may or may not be familiar with. So they did have a Consumer Reports to purchase 1,000 pounds of tomatoes, 1,000 pounds of peaches, 1,000 pounds of green peppers and apples in 5 different cities. They tested more than 300 synthetic pesticides to see if they were in these, thousands of pounds of food. And between all of the organic and non-organic foods tested, only one sample of each exceeded the federal limits. So what they really found is that even organic versus non-organic, conventionally grown products actually had really low levels of pesticides. And so for most of our products, the levels are really low. And some of that is because items that are GMO generally use less pesticides. And so that's, we do know that that's something that also helps with decreasing the use of those pesticides. So if you're someone who's concerned about pesticides, there's something called a certified pesticide residue-free seal. It looks, if you look at the upper right-hand corner, and you can see what that looks like, it means that that food has been tested for pesticide residue and that the residues are below levels specified for its standard. Certification guarantees that a product falls below the maximum residue limits for every export market. So this is something, if that's important to you, then that's something that you might want to look at. It's not very common, simply because they have to pay for that certification. The individual farmers have to pay for that certification, and because the overall pesticide levels have been very low, that many farmers just don't see the value in paying for that. So I have another poll for you, and it's which types of foods use only naturally occurring pesticides, fungicides, and fertilizers. So which food types, organic versus non-organic, uses only naturally occurring pesticides, fungicides, and fertilizers? Okay, I'll give everybody just a couple more seconds. So it's organic foods use only naturally occurring pesticides, fungicides, and fertilizers. Non-organic can use synthetic products. So only those products that are considered organic use only 100% naturally occurring products. So there's 4 categories of organic. I'm going to go through these kind of quickly so that we have, can get through everything. So there's what they call 100% organic and can be used to label a product that contains 100% of that product is organic except for salt and water, which are considered natural. Most raw, unprocessed farm products can be designated as 100% organic if they come straight from organic farming. And so that's one label, 100% organic. So it's must be on the front label saying 100% organic, and it must identify what its organic ingredients are. I'm just going to kind of go through these quickly. Then there's just organic. So if you look 100% organic versus organic, So organic is something that has a minimum of 95% of organic ingredients, excluding the salt in the water. Up to 5% of the ingredients may be non-organic and agricultural products that are not commercially available as organic and or non-agricultural products. So what this means is that it has to, if there's products that you can't find organic, then that's the 5%. If there's products that are naturally organic that you can find organic, you still cannot use the organic symbol. Then there's made with organic products. So it may be saying made with organic tomatoes, and that can be used if it contains at least 70% of the organic product. Once again, excluding salt and water. So it may state that it's made with organic tomatoes. It means that the product has at least 70% of the tomatoes are the ingredients are organic. But they still cannot use that organic USD organic seal because it's not 100% organic. They are not allowed to use the seal, which is that kind of brown circle with the half green, half white. So they can't use that seal if it's just made with organic ingredients. They can only use it if the entire product is 100% organic. And then once again, we can have kind of specific ingredients, like just kind of what I talked about before, but they still, and so they can say made with organic ingredients. And so real quick, I'm just going to ask you, do you have a preference for organic versus non-organic? Do you want to only eat organic foods? I only want non-organic or traditional growth made foods. I have no preference, or this information educated me on the difference. Okay. So it looks like most of you guys have really no preference. About 13%, like organic, prefer organic products, and about 38% kind of felt like it was educational on kind of what's that difference. So, once again, I'm not here to tell you what to choose. I'm just here to give you some information so that you can feel confident in whatever you choose. So I'm just going to go real quick through grass-fed versus grain-fed before we have to leave. I want to make sure I get you out of here on time. So the similarities are that both are good sources of protein, vitamins. They both go through safety inspections. They both have regulations. They both need FDA. They both may be given. So I think this is really important. Both grass-fed and grain-fed can be given antibiotics or growth promotants. So that's very different than the organic. They can't, right? So if something says grass-fed, a lot of people think that means that it's organic. It does not mean that it's organic. It's different. It's different. So they can have antibiotics and growth promotants. And they may also be given additional vitamins and mineral supplements. So the only real difference between grass-fed and grain-fed is that a grass-fed beef spend their entire lives grazing on pasture. So they are on the pasture the entire time. The grain-fed animals spend most of their lives grazing on the pasture, and then the last 4 to 6 months, they're actually sent to a feed yard where they're giving a kind of like a chow of different foods, basically to increase their weight faster. And so the difference, so that's the difference. The grass-fed is their entire lives are on the grass. Grain-fed, they start on the grass, and then they end up the last 4 to 6 months in a feed yard. And so while the feed cattle are fed grain for a certain period of time, it's to increase the rate of growth and also that marbling. So grass-fed animals, because they're more active, because the grass is not as, they're not gaining weight as quickly. The grain-fed beef is generally lower in fat. There's also a slightly different taste. So it's a preference. Some people like the grass-fed, some people like the grain-fed. So just so you know the difference. So I want to make sure that both are healthy, both great. So you can read this real quick while I kind of tell you the what we're going to do right now is I'm going to finish up my webinar. I appreciate all of you staying with us today. In order for me to send a certificate, you do need to complete the survey. So once I end the webinar, please stay on your laptop, your computer, whatever you're on your device, and a survey will pop up. I do need you to complete that survey and submit it. That way it gives me that verification that you participated and you stayed throughout the whole webinar. I will send out the certificates in the next 48 hours. If you haven't received a certificate from me before, it may go to your spam folder. So if you want to put my email address in your contacts, that way it'll go directly to your inbox. I appreciate all of you joining us tonight. I hope you have a great rest of your night, and I hope you got some good information out of today's webinar. Thank you so much, and I'm going to end the webinar, and please stay on your device so that it will pop up your survey.